She thought she was orchestrating the perfect corporate execution, dragging her shallow coworker to human resources to get her fired. She had no idea she was handing me the exact weapon I'd use to get her fired by 5 o'clock that afternoon. Jill was an office predator. She wasn't the boss, but with her unchecked entitlement and a best friend in human resources, she didn't need to be. For months, she had been circling me, her perfectly glossed lips curled into a perpetual condescending smirk, completely unaware of the absolute hell I had crawled through just to earn the right to stand in that office and feel human. 4 years ago, my mother died of breast cancer. Both of my grandmothers went the exact same way. When a specialist found the same precancerous time bomb ticking in my own chest, I didn't hesitate. I chose a bilateral mastectomy. I chose to live. But the aftermath wasn't some pink ribbon victory parade. I was left with 2 jagged scars across my chest, a brutal reminder of the disease that tried to kill me. The trauma shattered me. I threw out every mirror in my apartment. I couldn't look at my own reflection without becoming physically ill. It took a therapist and a reconstructive surgeon to pull me back from the ledge. The implants I received weren't a cosmetic luxury. They were reconstructive armor. They were the only reason I could finally look at myself without breaking down.
But Jill didn't know about the cancer, and she didn't care to ask. She had overheard a private conversation about my surgery, and within hours she had weaponized it. She painted me as a vain plastic bimbo who had milked our company insurance to get a free chest upgrade. The harassment was relentless, a slow drip of poison designed to assert her dominance. And whenever she caught me off guard, in the elevator or the bathroom, she'd lean in tight and make sure everyone heard. Careful near the radiator, wouldn't want to melt all that plastic. She called me a sack of silicone behind my back and fake in 2 ways to my face. I asked her politely 4 separate times to back off. She just smiled that razor-thin smile, knowing her HR connections made her completely bulletproof. The breaking point happened in the break room. 6 of us were sitting around when the topic of shallow people came up. Jill couldn't resist. She leaned across the table, locking her cold, judgmental eyes onto mine, and jabbed a manicured finger directly at my chest. "Well, you'd know all about being shallow," she sneered, expecting the usual awkward silence from our terrified coworkers. Instead, I snapped. I dropped my fork. The metal clattered violently against the table, deadening the room. I laid out the brutal, unvarnished truth. I told her about the cancer. I told her about the jagged scars, the severe depression, and the reconstructive surgery that saved my sanity. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "I had cancer, Jill. What's your excuse?" The whole break room went dead silent. She was left staring at me, pale, exposed, and humiliated in front of an audience. But a narcissist never retreats. They retaliate. Instead of apologizing, Jill immediately ran to her friend Debbie in HR, spinning a web of lies and filing a formal complaint against me for creating a hostile work environment. She thought she had me backed into a corner. She assumed I would just roll over and accept my termination quietly to avoid the embarrassment. What she completely failed to realize was that I had spent the last 24 hours meticulously turning the entire office into an army against her. She didn't know I had combed through the fine print of my employment contract, finding the exact legal loophole I needed to strip her friend of any power. And she certainly didn't know about the 16 signed witness statements sitting in my bag, detailing every hateful, fat-phobic, and anti-Semitic comment she had ever spewed in that building. Jill was preparing for an execution, entirely blind to the fact that her own head was already resting on the chopping block. At exactly 9:55 a.m., I stood up from my desk and walked straight to HR. As I passed Jill's cubicle, she didn't even try to hide it.
She leaned back in her chair, smiling like she'd already won. She mimed a little sad pout, a mocking, theatrical farewell to the sack of silicone she was so certain was taking her final walk. I didn't break stride. I didn't scowl. I didn't give her a single ounce of the reaction she was starved for. I just let my fingers tighten slightly around the cheap beige manila folder in my right hand. It was a flimsy piece of cardboard, but to me, it felt heavy. It contained the nuclear launch codes for her entire career. I pushed through the heavy glass doors into HR. Debbie stood by her desk with a fake sympathetic smile, but her eyes were just as vicious as Jill's. "Right this way," she said, pointing to an interview room. Another HR representative sat quietly at a desk nearby, blindly tapping at a keyboard, completely oblivious to the execution about to take place. I stopped dead in my tracks. The air in the room grew instantly stagnant. "So, is my meeting with you then?" I asked, nodding toward the other representative. Debbie's smug smile vanished, replaced by an ugly, territorial scowl. "No," she snapped. "You're with me." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch. Crisp sound of paper sliced through the tense silence. I didn't blink. I just opened my folder and said, "Actually, I'm not meeting with you." I slid a heavily highlighted photocopy across her desk, keeping my palm firmly pressed against the bottom edge. I knew exactly how close we were to the industrial shredder in the corner, and I wasn't about to make my evidence disappear. Section 4, Paragraph 2 of my employment contract explicitly states my right to an impartial overseer during any formal grievance process, and I have it on excellent authority that the complainant on the other end of this issue is your close personal friend. For a split second, Debbie looked like she'd been slapped across the face. Her jaw tightened, a flush of angry, mottled red creeping up her neck and staining her cheeks. She instinctively twitched, trying to snatch the paper, but my hand was a vice. "I can be perfectly impartial," she hissed, the faux professionalism completely evaporating into pure venomous spite. She looked at me like I was a cockroach that had just demanded legal representation. But the trap was already springing shut, and she was stepping right on to the trigger. She knew she couldn't blatantly violate a black and white contractual clause with another HR rep sitting barely 10 feet away. Breathing heavily through her nose, she spun on her heel and stomped down the hall, her heels striking the linoleum like hammer blows. She was going to fetch the department supervisor, fully intending to make me burn for this little delay. 2 minutes later, the supervisor appeared. He was a tired-looking man, his shoulders slumped with the exhaustion of someone who clearly didn't have the patience for high school drama masking his corporate protocol. He looked between us, assessing the standoff. "What makes you think she can't be impartial?" he asked me, his tone guarded. I looked right past Debbie's furious glare and gave him the exact same deadpan delivery. "Because Jill is her friend." He slowly turned to Debbie. "Is that true?" he asked. Debbie couldn't even look him in the eye. Her only defense was a pathetic, stubborn repetition of, "I can be impartial." The supervisor just sighed, a deep, weary sound, and ordered the second HR rep to join us. The four of us marched into the conference room. Debbie sat there glaring at me, completely unaware she'd just locked herself in a room with her own firing squad. Debbie started the interrogation immediately. She aggressively tried to paint me as the villain who had terrorized poor innocent Jill, demanding why I had suddenly attacked her best friend in the break room without provocation. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get defensive. I looked directly past Debbie, locked eyes with the supervisor, and laid out the unbroken chain of events. I explained the preventative double mastectomy, The brutal scarring, the deep depression, and the reconstructive implants, all thoroughly documented in my medical file, which I formally invited him to pull. The supervisor's pen stopped scratching against his notepad. The air in the room grew instantly heavy. Debbie's smug, predatory sneer faltered, a flicker of genuine uncertainty, finally cracking her porcelain mask. Then came the kill shot. Debbie, desperately trying to salvage her friend's hit job, demanded proof that Jill had ever harassed me. She assumed it was just my word against hers. I opened my flimsy beige folder and slid a thick stack of papers across the polished mahogany table. 16 signed, dated, and highly detailed witness statements. I watched in absolute silence as the supervisor read the first letter, then the second, then the third. He read about the sack of silicone remarks. He read the bullet-pointed lists exposing Jill's fat-phobic insults and the blatantly anti-Semitic comments she had made about another coworker's nose. With every page he turned, the color drained from Debbie's face. She was realizing in real time that her best friend wasn't a victim. She was a massive corporate liability. The supervisor didn't need to hear anything else. He stood up, closed the folder, and formally ended the meeting, shaking my hand before sending me back to my desk. I sat down, pulled up my resume just in case, and waited. An hour later, the grim reaper of human resources began to make his rounds. One by one, the coworkers who had signed those letters were called into the glass office. They were gone for 10 minutes, then returned, tapping the next person on the shoulder. The entire floor watched this silent, methodical parade, and sitting right in the middle of it all was Jill. I watched her perfectly manicured nails drumming frantically against her desk. The panic was slowly washing over her as she realized her entire empire of gossip was crumbling to ash, and she wasn't even invited to the autopsy. At 3:30 p.m., the phone on Jill's desk finally rang. She marched towards HR, chin held high, fully expecting her friend Debbie to hand her my severed head on a silver platter. 30 agonizing minutes later, she stormed back into the cubicle farm. The arrogant swagger was entirely gone, replaced by a frantic, white-hot rage. She didn't speak. She just started violently shoving her belongings into a cardboard box. By 5 o'clock, the predator of the office was dragging her box towards the elevator, glaring daggers at my desk, while loudly, pathetically crying to anyone who would listen that I had gotten her fired. 10 minutes later, a sterile automated email pinged into my inbox. Case closed. Jill thought her toxic friendships made her untouchable. She thought she could mock my trauma and walk away clean. But karma doesn't yell. It just hands you a cardboard box and tells you to pack your desk.